been here before, Lost City Books is a used, new, and rare bookstore. We specialize in a pretty carefully curated selection of all different kinds of books, but especially books like gang politics, covering issues that are really important to us here at Lost City Books. And so we're very grateful to have you. Thank you for coming. For those of you watching from home, you can type any questions that you have into the chat. Kristian, I'd like to introduce you to our people here. Kristian Williams is an American anarchist author. He's best known as the author of Our Enemies in Blue, Police and Power in America, and now Gang Politics. In these 3 taught essays, Kristian examines our society's understanding of social and political violence, what gets romanticized, misunderstood, or muddled. So we're going to hear a little bit more about all of that in this wonderful talk. I'd like to welcome you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about your background.
Sure. So since this is mostly going to be an online event, I'm going to direct my attention this way. My intellectual work grew out of my political work. I was doing activism around questions of policing and police brutality. And doing that were one of the things I frequently encountered sort of puzzles as to why the police were doing the kinds of things they were doing. And looking at the existing left-wing literature did not do much to answer those questions. It turned out looking at the policing literature did not do much to answer those questions either. And so I engaged in a series of sort of historical examinations, which started me writing articles about the police and then eventually led to a history of the police in the United States called Our Enemies in Blue. In that book, I made an argument that the 2 most recent developments in American policing, that being militarization and community policing, were actually 2 aspects of a single phenomenon, which was the domestic application of counterinsurgency in the United States. And that militarization represented sort of the hard coercive edge, and community policing represented the kind of hearts and minds approach, as well as attempts to co-opt and channel energy that may otherwise be directed toward resistance. From that observation, I wrote the first of the 3 main chapters of Gang Politics, which looked at the use of counterinsurgency as it applies to gang policing in the United States. And that posed an obvious question, which is, if the police are using counterinsurgency to fight gangs, in what way do gangs resemble insurgencies? That then became the basis for the second essay in the collection. And then at the end, I bring the sort of gang conflict frame up to the present and consider what features of the Proud Boys on the one hand and Antifa on the other hand stand out if we apply that gang framework to that activity. So with that in mind, I'm going to read a relatively short passage from the second essay, which is called Gangs, States, and Insurgencies. Among the unanticipated consequences of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, we may count the growing recognition that the American police employed the techniques of counterinsurgency against American street gangs. Hence, military advisors have consulted with local police departments, researchers have applied counterinsurgency methodology and Defense Department technology to the analysis of crime statistics, and returning veterans have applied the skills they gained in foreign campaigns to their new jobs in law enforcement. This adaptation of counterinsurgency warfare to anti-gang policing poses an important question. Are gangs insurgents? Some military theorists and police strategists clearly think that they are, at least some gangs under certain circumstances. John Sullivan, a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy, warns in one Rand Corporation report, some gangs have begun to adopt varying degrees of political activity. At the low end, This activity may include dominating neighborhood life and creating virtual lawless zones, the application of street taxes, or taxes on other criminal actors. Gangs with more sophisticated political attributes typically co-opt police and government officials to limit interference of their activities. At the high end, some gangs have active political agendas using the political process to further their ends and destabilize governments. Among the examples Sullivan cites are the Gangster Disciples, a gang with 30,000 members in 35 states. In addition to employing themselves in the drug trade, the Gangster Disciples fund a political action committee, infiltrate police and private security agencies, sponsor political candidates, register voters, and organize protest marches. Likewise, another gang, the Unknown Conservative Vice Lords, has embraced similar activities, including establishing a nonprofit political association known as the United Conservative Voters League. At the extreme, Sullivan points to the Black Peace Donations 1986 plot by rocket-propelled grenades for a Gaddafi-funded terror campaign. Had Sullivan looked further into the past, as many gang members do, he would have been forced to admit that these forays into politics were nothing new. Historically, many of today's gangs began as protective measures against racist violence. Los Angeles' first gang problem involved white gangs with names like the Spook Hunters, enforcing the city's de facto segregation and occasionally attacking Black neighborhoods. Black gangs emerged in the late 1940s as defensive bodies and then became increasingly politicized as a result of the 1965 Watts riots. During that uprising, rival sets put aside their differences and fought together, and an informal ceasefire held for more than 3 years afterward. Following the riots, one gang, the Slossons, the largest in Los Angeles at the time, boasting 5,000 members, initiated the Community Alert Patrol. They followed the cops with cameras and notebooks a year before the Black Panthers began their armed patrols in Oakland. One Slosson, Ron Wilkins, became a leader of the local chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Another, Princess Bunchy Carter, founded the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party after meeting Eldridge Cleaver, the Panthers Minister of Information, who was teaching an African-American history and culture class in Soledad Prison. Likewise, in Chicago, Jose Chacha Jimenez, a leader of the Puerto Rican street gang, the Young Lords, pushed his group to take on more of a public service ethos beginning in 1964. Then, after meeting Panther leader Fred Hampton in jail in 1968, Jimenez began modeling the Young Lords organization on the Black Panther Party. The Young Lords created their own 13-point program, sponsored food and clothing giveaways, and offered free breakfast for children. In the same period, in Chicago's uptown neighborhood, a group of young people associated with JOIN, Jobs or Income Now, formed a semi-autonomous group called the Goodfellows. Historians Amy Sunny and James Tracy describe it as a cross between a street gang and a loose-knit radical social club. The Goodfellows opened a venue for bands and other social engagements and set out to unite and politicize local gangs, specifically organizing against police brutality. They began a patrol to observe the police and document the abuse they witnessed, borrowing the idea from Community Alert in Los Angeles. Later, when JOIN folded, the Goodfellows, inspired by the example of the Panthers, formed the Young Patriots organization, drafting their own 10-point program, opening community health clinics, and running a free breakfast program. Under Fred Hampton's guidance, the Young Lords and the Young Patriots joined together with the Panthers in a rainbow coalition, which he envisioned as the vanguard of the dispossessed. Or, as another Panther organizer, Bob Lee, later put it, the Rainbow Coalition was just a code word for class struggle. A generation later, another truce and another riot seemed to signal a new period of politicization. On March 27, 1992, just before the outbreak of rioting in response to the acquittal of the cops filmed beating Rodney King, 4 Los Angeles gangs signed a formal peace agreement modeled on the 1948 Arab-Israeli ceasefire. Articles 1, 2, and 4 of the Multi-Peace Treaty General Armistice Agreement called for an end to violence, established principles of non-aggression, and detailed the terms of the peace. Article 3 looked to the larger society to establish conditions under which peace would be sustainable, specifically the return of Black businesses, economic development, and educational programs. The treaty came after months of negotiations, initiated by older gang members and the Coalition Against Police Abuse, a group founded by former Black Panthers working to keep the party's legacy alive while also learning from its mistakes. Gang violence declined at once. The homicide rate fell an astonishing 87.5% in truce areas. Latino gangs soon made similar moves, declaring an end to drive-by shootings and immediately reducing the citywide total by 25%. By 1998, LA's overall homicide rate had declined 36.7%. The police responded to the ceasefire by intensifying repression. They targeted truce leaders for surveillance, raids, arrests, and deportation. They also employed a variety of dirty tricks, spreading rumors to create distrust, snitch-jacketing leaders to provoke retaliation, and spray painting one gang's tags over another's to spark conflict. For the state, the ceasefire represented a political problem. As the Los Angeles County Gang Task Force argued in one report, the impact of gang truces on communities can be negative. A truce can reinforce the gang's identity. At worst, it serves to legitimize the identity of a gang and its members and link them to its legitimate reach. Connie Wright, a civil rights lawyer who helps with the gang negotiations, eventually came to agree. In her memoir, she described the truce as a bad idea and a big mistake, worrying that such efforts make the gang stronger, more cohesive, and more attractive, ultimately validating the gang's status. She now advises police departments on their campaigns against gangs, taking a counterinsurgency approach. It seems that however much the cops may dislike gang violence, they like gang peace even less. Whatever their limitations and contradictions, gangs in the period of rebellion represented an armed challenge to state control. So long as banging kept the gangs divided and thus weak, the public fear of gang violence could be leveraged into support for policing. Trucing, in contrast, emphasized the gang's common circumstances and, in the context of riots, common enemies. Furthermore, the drop in violence brought the gangs a measure of community support, which was dangerous from the state's perspective, more so, apparently, than drive-by shootings. Like all political actors, street gangs rely on a combination of force and legitimacy. In his seminal ethnographic study, Islands of the Street, Martin Sanchez-Jankowski notes 4 things gangs need from the community: recruits, information, psychological support, and most of all, a safe haven from which to operate. In other words, he writes, what the gang requires from the community is total non-cooperation with law enforcement. To acquire these needs, it is important to maintain some level of popular support, which requires in turn that the gang meet some important social need. The community needs certain services that the gang can provide. Probably the most important service is protection. Sanchez-Jankowski documents gangs offering protection against street crime, including other gangs, loan sharks, price gouging, gentrification, mafia-style racketeering, and threats to the ethnic or cultural character of the neighborhood. Though this relationship is reciprocally beneficial, it remains asymmetrical. The gang needs the community more than the community needs the gang. Therefore, it is only ever the community that has the power to directly dissolve the arrangement, either passively through informal disapproval, withholding information, and discouraging recruitment, or actively by going to the police. Such actions typically result from some dereliction on the part of the gang, either failing to provide protection or losing control of its own members. The cops naturally look to exploit such lapses, but they too rely on the public support, and the balance can be difficult to maintain. For example, in the late 1980s, street battles over crack cocaine markets and the resulting epidemic of drive-by shootings created unusual levels of neighborhood support for the LAPD's aggressive tactics. This support, however, proved short-lived as the siege-like atmosphere and regular brutality came to fuel resentments that have exploded into rioting in 1992 after the acquittal of the police who beat Rodney King. Perhaps then the issue of gang politics has been wrongly framed. Perhaps the relevant comparison is not between gangs and insurgents, but between gangs and states. The historian Charles Tilley, in his brief and penetrating essay, War Making and State Making as Organized Crime, argued that the projects of government and that of crime are essentially similar, and that both can be fairly characterized as protection rackets. Tilley doesn't say that gangs and governments are identical, but that they belong on the same continuum, which implies difference as well as resemblance. What distinguished the violence produced by states from the violence delivered by anyone else? Tilley asks rhetorically, and then replies, in the long term, enough to make the division between legitimate and illegitimate force credible. Eventually, the personnel of states pervade violence on a larger scale, more effectively, more efficiently, and with wider assent from their subject populations and readier collaboration from neighboring authorities than did the personnel of other organizations. The main differences, in other words, are those of scale, power, public assent, and peer recognition. By this telling, which Tilley backs with historical accounts of the formation of European nation states as well as clear-sighted conceptual analysis, governments are just extremely successful criminal enterprises. States are built by crooks who have managed to accumulate enough power that they can eliminate their rivals, impose peace by monopolizing violence, and in the process win a measure of popular support. The economists Sergio Skepardos and Konstantinos Staropoulos began at the other end of the spectrum and reached similar conclusions. Given the shared tendency to control territory and exclude rivals, they write, it could be useful to think of organizations like gangs as states. They outline the process as follows. When force determines how many resources you can receive, and the amount of force you exert depends on your resources, there are compounding rewards to having an initial superiority of resources. Therefore, also, there are compounding rewards when it comes to monopolizing force. The type of organization emerging from this competitive struggle will most probably be subjugational, authoritarian, and hierarchical. However, they continue, the rulers would always want to reduce the waste of resources associated with use of force and protracted conflict if it could be done with minimal threat to their rule. One way to do that would be to convince their subjects of their rule's legitimacy. The relationship between legitimacy and violence is necessarily a complex one. Legitimacy simultaneously makes violence more available and constrains its use. When an agency's violence is viewed as legitimate, it is less likely to provoke resistance. But the very need to maintain the appearance of legitimacy means that on the whole, such violence must be kept within socially prescribed bounds. Fortunately, legitimacy may also make violence less necessary, as it brings access to other resources and broadens the range of available strategies and tactics. Individuals, institutions, and movements that have achieved a measure of legitimacy are more likely, whether or not they invoke coercive sanctions like violence, to have their claims respected, their instructions obeyed, and their interests protected. Violence may still be used, sometimes in large measure, but legitimacy reduces the dependence on force. In fact, an over-reliance on coercion is one indication that legitimacy is lacking. Necessarily then, legitimacy cannot be understood as the property of the state in either sense, as a rightful possession or as an essential characteristic. Legitimacy, instead, emerges as part of an ongoing social process, typically a political struggle. As such, it is continuously being produced and always being tested and contested. Insurgencies arise where the state's legitimacy is weak, and though rebellions fail for any number of reasons, when they succeed, it is in large part because the insurgent forces have gained the support and loyalty of the population. The political is primary in two senses. It defines the cause of the conflict, and it often determines the outcome. The threat posed by groups like the Panthers was less in their potential for violence than in their challenging to the legitimacy of the state. That explains, among other things, why the FBI specifically targeted their free breakfast program. It anchored them in the community and brought them broad support. States, in other words, would rather face gangs than insurgencies. They prefer crime to revolution. With all this in mind, the logic of using counterinsurgency to combat gangs becomes clear. It's not that gangs are insurgents, but that the authorities wish to prevent them from becoming insurgents. At the same time, governments are only too happy to see insurgencies disintegrate into rival gang conflict. It is a truism that states monopolize rather than eliminate violence. What is less commonly recognized is the important qualifier. As one Rand Corporation report on counterinsurgency explains, the key in counterinsurgency is not to monopolize force, but to monopolize legitimate force. A government can tolerate and even exploit the persistence of violence outside of its control, as long as that violence is widely regarded as illegitimate. One way that a state enforces its monopoly is by criminalizing its rivals. It can then legitimize its own violence by framing it as protection against their violence. Public fear of illegal violence, whether crime or terrorism, can bolster support for the state's repressive apparatus, the curtailment of individual rights, and the intensification of state violence against suspect populations. For states, then, violence is not the problem, not even illegal violence. The crucial question is one of legitimacy. Both gangs and insurgencies are rivals to the state, but not all rivals are equal. From the state's point of view, gangs are preferable to guerrillas. As gangs come to resemble insurgents, they become more dangerous to the state, even if they become less dangerous to the public. Because legitimacy is ultimately more important than force, the political threat is more dangerous than the criminal one. Contrarily, as insurgencies decay and become more gang-like, they become less dangerous to the state, but very likely more dangerous to the community. Gangs and states each offer a kind of protection, but in each case, the price for the client population is a relationship of dependency and exploitation. When insurgencies aspire to state power, or less ambitiously, to the armed control of territories within an existing state, they will generally tend to replicate these same dynamics. The challenge for liberatory movements, then, is not merely to launch an insurgency capable of overturning the existing power structure, but to create new ways of relating, of organizing, of exercising and sharing power that do not themselves reproduce the logic of a protection racket. And that brings to an end today's sermon. Did you have questions?
Absolutely. Brilliant, powerful stuff. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I was interested in what you were sort of beginning to expand on there about the sort of fluid nature of the legitimacy of the state and how it is a continuous process. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how over the past couple of years, especially, we have seen a lot of resistance movements that have kind of begun to borrow or sort of reframe and refresh some of the tactics that were, for example, used by the Black Panther Party. And now the way that the state has responded through what many are accurately calling a more severe crackdown of police violence and all these shenanigans with the Supreme Court and cutbacks on labor laws and cutbacks on civil support systems and aid systems while we're still in the middle of a pandemic. I wonder if you have just kind of thoughts about that.
Yeah, so the thing, so in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the cities across the country erupted in demonstrations, many of which developed into riots. Some of which, in Portland, where I live, they went on for more than 3 months. And the thing that was remarkable about that is less the level of militancy, I think, and more the low ebb of police legitimacy, at least at any time that I recall. And that was reflected immediately in the widespread expression of support for the demonstrations. And even, according to one poll, something like 2/3 of Americans expressed support for burning down the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, which was just unimaginable a few months before. But as I was saying, the exercise of the excesses of police violence and being so clearly demonstrated undercut the legitimacy of the institution. And of course, it wasn't simply the one event. It was that event stood for so much more. There was a kind of reservoir of grievance that it tapped into. Immediately, we saw 2 approaches being employed at the same time. One being the increase in violence and the brutal repression of the demonstrations, really with no relationship to how militant or not the demonstrations were. And predictably, a violent police response actually tended to feed violence on the side of the demonstrators rather than repress it. The other approach being the immediate attempt to offer concessions and promises of reform, and to sort of try to co-opt the movement, and in many places for police leaders to try to align themselves with the movement calling for police reform as a way of trying to sort of like get in front of it and steer it in one direction rather than another. Predictably, once the demonstrations sort of petered out, the coercive apparatus of the police went back to doing essentially what it normally does, and with a certain concentration on bringing charges against people who had been involved in the militant activities. At the same time, the concessions that had been put into place, or the reforms that had promised, immediately started getting rolled back. And so, probably the clearest example of that is the city of Minneapolis voting to disband its police department and instead replace it with a different kind of public safety apparatus. And despite the city council voting for it, despite the promises that was like the thing that was going to solve the problem, like none of that actually came to pass. Like dozens and dozens of cities announced that they were going to cut the police budgets, and did, and then reinstated them basically the minute that people stopped burning down buildings, which says something about the force of rioting as applying political pressure, but it also says something about the limits of it once that pressure is released. What I think has been, I guess, more nefarious in the time since then is the attempt to recruit and co-opt and sort of tokenize particular people who can make some sort of claim to being in leadership from that movement and can make some sort of claim to representing those interests, and then using their voices to re-legitimize the police department or re-legitimize the city government overall. But again, in terms of counterinsurgency theory, all of that is just sort of by the book. That is exactly what we should have expected. Of course, the point that you raise of the the context of the continued polarization of society and the direction that the courts are headed, I think really shows that that nothing that it's not enough to win rights; they also have to be defended, and that our society is divided in a way of there being on the one side people who are really insistent about wanting their rights, and on the other side a counterforce which was mobilized to deny them and to preserve existing inequalities. How that's going to work out is worrying.
So I feel similarly. You touched on something that I'm really curious about, if you would like to expand on. You mentioned sort of state apparatuses, co-opting movement leaders to serve their own aims. And that made me think a lot about how in the present day, we have so much instant communication with technology, so much so that everything has become almost a commodity. So you can commodify even justice movements, and then movement leaders become small celebrities in some ways. And then on the other hand, it's like this incredible tool of surveillance for the state, and the state is able to very easily kind of manipulate and manufacture through social media, for example, or through just the speed at which information is exchanged through all of these channels. And I wonder if, I know that your book talks a little bit about present day groups. We'll call them gangs for the sake of the book. And I wonder, yeah, I wonder if you make any connections between these present day groups and that sort of manufactured legitimacy / celebrity / it's all of that.
That's not something that I directly talk about here. I do talk a little bit about I more indicate the potentials of social media in terms of surveillance and intelligence analysis. And one of the things that a major aspect of counterinsurgency as it's implemented involves the mapping of populations and the mapping of relationships between people. And a lot of the Defense Department has spent a lot of money designing software that will help identify insurgent networks and distinguish who the militants are and who like supporters are and like where the resources come from and all that kind of stuff. And then that's been applied domestically in terms of mapping communities in order to identify gangs and gang associates and possible conflict points, and also strategically important people that can be isolated and in a policing sense usually arrested and prosecuted. Not so much because of their specific activity, but because doing so will be disruptive to the structure of the gang. So a maybe chilling aspect of social media is that Facebook pretty much just does that automatically, right? It creates those maps, it maps those relationships, it knows who has strong ties and knows who has weak ties, and all of that information is commercially available if you have enough resources to buy it, which of course government does. And so there's something that was this like really difficult intelligence question has now become information that we provide voluntarily in the course of maintaining our social network, and then is commercially available for really anybody who wants to use it. And of course you're right that one one way of using that is to figure out like who would be disruptive to arrest. Another way of using that is to figure out what messages, like what kind of propaganda people are going to be responsive to. And I mean, that really is like the Cambridge Analytica example, but who, in real time edited ads according to how much they were getting shared. So it was to maximize how much they were getting shared, which, and not just ads, but also like disinformation that they could then flood, enemy networks with. And, to some degree that this is a product of the technology, and to some degree this is a product of the labor that people using the technology provide, right? And yeah, the possibility of that being used in terms of amplifying positions that the authorities want amplified, or simply sowing confusion. I mean, the Russian disinformation model seems to be simply throwing everything into the system so that people kind of give up on figuring out what's true and what's not. And again, the implications of all of that are very important.
I doubt there's a subject that we could touch on here of which the implications are not worrying. I think that's where we are. I have one more question, and then I promise to open it up to the rest of you wonderful people. I wanted to kind of swivel also to the subject of corporations, specifically in the US, and how many of the large corporations have ultimately the political power of a nation on their own. For example, Amazon comes to mind. And if you have noticed some of the characteristics of the state / the gangs / the forces that you're talking about in this book being employed by these corporations in ways that influence sort of the direction of public discourse, of political decisions, and so on and so forth.
Yes, although with, I think, this important caveat, which in general, corporations don't try to encroach on the state's monopoly on violence. Instead, they try to influence how the state uses that monopoly on violence. There are some exceptions to that, like, there are private prisons, there are companies like Whack and Nuts, there's whatever Blackwater is calling itself this month. It's essentially a private army, right? But on the whole, corporations are relatively content to allow the state to maintain its monopoly on violence. But I think that's historically, that seems to be contingent on the government using that violence in a way that serves the interests of the corporations. And so if you look at the history of policing, we tend to think of policing as just this it's like an inherent state function, right? But over the history of it, a lot of policing has actually been done by private actors. And when in the early 20th century, for example, or late 19th century, then early 20th century, when local cops proved not really up to the task of breaking strikes, partly because there weren't that many of them, and partly because often they had familial and communal ties with the people who were on strike. Corporations responded by creating private police forces, which they would then recruit from all over the country, which then didn't have those same checks on their behavior and would behave pretty ruthlessly, often just murdering strikers. In the 1930s, the state, specifically the state of Pennsylvania, became a little impatient with this idea of private armies just roaming the countryside. And at the same time, the coal and steel owners became tired of paying for a private army. And so the first state police force, the Pennsylvania State Constabulary, was created, which literally just took over the coal and iron police, which was the private army that had been created for strike breaking, and continued in exactly the same work, but now with the legitimacy of the state and now being paid by tax dollars. And that kind of move between state forces and private forces, and who has the right to policing, and how sort of solid the state's monopoly on violence is, has moved back and forth repeatedly throughout history. And really the main determining factor has been how well the state is serving the interests of the corporations or not.
Well said. Thank you. All right, I would like to now open the questions up to the floor.
Anyone?
So, I lived in Miami for a while, and there's an expression in the fashion industry that the underground determines the mainstream. So something at some point might be regarded as taboo, and then over the course of time, it starts to get adopted by more and more people, and then it becomes more mainstream. I live in Arlington at the moment, and there have been some changes that have gone into effect, partly because of a law that's been implemented in Richmond, the Marcus Alert Law, which was driven by a black biology teacher in Richmond who was killed by law enforcement, despite the fact that he was naked and unarmed at the time. One of the transitions that they're talking about a lot in Arlington, which is somewhat influenced by Gary Peller at Georgetown Law, is a transition that they're discussing as one of away from race neutral policing to what they're calling race explicit policing. So this is driven partly by a lot of faculty members at Georgetown Law, such as Professor Peller, who have made the assertion that despite the fact that there was a generation of efforts driven by race neutral policing, that there are some failures associated with race neutral policing. And therefore there have to be more transitions effectuated now that are along the lines of race explicit policing. So we've gone through, we used to have a nickname for the coin doctrine that some of us used to call the coindinistas. So the coindinistas were those who were advocates of the counterinsurgency doctrine. As far as politicized violence goes, that also, if you look at the transition in '68, some people regard that as a demarcation point where politicized violence became more acceptable, because there was the perception that which had preceded it, integrationist or assimilationist approaches, were somehow inadequate or they were failing. So do you see different things that were previously regarded as taboo that are now becoming more mainstream and more, and this is, so the initial reaction to it is, I kind of look at it as there's a bifurcation between establishmentarian mainstream institutionalist views at that point, and then you see more of a revolutionary mindset that in some cases even advocates for a deinstitutionalization in order to essentially bring about something different or something new. Even at one point in the previous administration under Steve Bannon used to use this phrase constantly, which he called rollback. What we're trying to effectuate is a rollback of the administrative state. Now, that was actually regarded in many circles as code. The code was that what he was really asserting was that many aspects of the New Deal and the Great Society needed to be privatized or eliminated altogether. Right? And so it's almost like you have a battle between social Darwinists and some social justice warriors who were trying to point out the effects of unmitigated, unbridled shareholder capitalism. So as you look at that, and like you said, you see the manifestations of the previous administration in terms of Cambridge Analytica trying to manipulate disinformation through psychographics in particular. What's the prognosis, the forecast for more transitions? We're going to see more transitions to race explicit policing Yet now there's a perception that you just had 1 million registered voters, mostly suburban whites, presumably, who just switched party affiliation, I guess because they're upset about inflation, or that's the argument on the mainstream press.
Okay, there's a lot there. Let me pick up a couple things and see if I can tie you together. In terms of things that were taboo, which are moving mainstream, unfortunately, like there's some good news in that area and there's some bad news in that area. The good news in that area is that the idea of police abolition is, like, when I started doing this work, would like not even the far left was taking that idea seriously. It got a boost in 2014 after the Ferguson uprising, and then it became a matter of like actual political debate in 2020 because of the George Floyd uprising. And so that is an idea which, you know, was like not that long ago would just get you locked out of the room, and which now, like, not only serious people in the sense of like serious theorists, but serious people in the sense of like policy wonks are considering and you know, taking this kind of a challenge to figuring out, like, well, if we don't want this implacably racist institution whose main job seems to be to distribute surveillance of violence, then how do we, you know, provide for public safety, resolve disputes, that sort of thing. So that's moved from like the margin of the margin to at least in the spectrum of respectable political. On the other hand, on the right, many of the ideas of white nationalism have moved into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And as long as you don't call it white nationalism, a lot of people seem to be willing to accept the ideas, if not the label. Similarly, conspiracy thinking has gone completely like mainstream in a way that I think has surprised probably everyone. And so, you know, I don't think it wasn't that long ago that ranting about Jewish space lasers would just disqualify you from office, but now it seems not to, right? So again, we're not going to talk about anything that isn't concerning. In terms of policing, I mean, well, and okay, so to take up the question of
Yeah, I mean, that is the point you bring, because Minneapolis City Council, after Floyd's murder, they said, you know what, just got to maybe start from scratch,
right,
because the marginal tinkering around the edges is not working. Let's just go boom back down to base zero and try to rebuild from that. It's kind of like the Bannon approach in some ways, but it's you know,
from the left.
Yeah.
In terms of the race explicit policing, I mean, we've never really had race neutral policing. Like, policing has always reinforced white supremacy, and that goes all the way back to its origin. I mean, you know, this is a very thin book, so I didn't talk about the whole history, but in my first book, Armies of Blue, I traced the origin of the Minneapolis police force from the slave patrols before that, and show how the one institution emerged from the other, but the core function remained essentially stable. And so, and what we've seen really since the 60s is that it's continued in the function of maintaining white supremacy, but has done it with race neutral language, and has also done it with a more diversified workforce. So, you know, we've managed to make, in most places, the police department demographically is more or less representative of the city that it polices. And yet it continues in that function of maintaining white supremacy. What that reveals is that the problem here isn't with personnel, the problem is with the institution. Changing the personnel actually isn't enough to change the institution. Whether making the racial dynamics of policing more explicit is going to make it visible in a way that it can then be alleviated. I'm skeptical of, but it's certainly true that adding the race neutral language didn't relieve the problem. In terms of what I think is forthcoming in terms of like future of policing, I expect we're going to see a lot more reforms that take on the language of racial justice, but are actually ways of re-legitimizing the police department, adding resources, giving it larger scope. You know, I mean, we've already seen the calls for, you know, more funding, more training, more personnel, that sort of thing. But you know, that's an old story. Like that, the entire 20th century was an experiment in police reform, and at the end of it, we have better armed, better trained, better funded police than ever before, and yet the same essential problems in terms of their social function. I think there's also a real possibility that Trump's couple of experiments with using federal police to intervene locally will, that's probably not the last time we're going to see that. But we'll probably see the Department of Homeland Security deployed in American cities, especially in response to unrest again in the future. I don't know how soon, I don't know how extensively, but I doubt that they're done with that approach.
Thank you. Time for some more questions if you like. Anyone?
Please.
Appreciate it. Yeah. So there was a fundraiser recently at the McLean Hilton where Mitt Romney was giving this address and so forth. And this goes back to the theme earlier of concerning developments. During the course of the fundraiser and the speech, Mitt Romney is discussing 4,000 years of human history. And as he's going through the speech at his fundraiser, microphone, very bougie hotel here in the inner suburbs, very close to Tyson's Corner. He then suggests that 4,000 years of human history and recent developments would prognosticate a descent into more acceptance of autocratic authoritarianism in many pockets, in many circles, whether we're talking about the Bannon on the one hand, or I guess it's more of that deinstitutionalization mindset because everything else has failed, and oh, we've got the fourth industrial revolution, the transition from the factory to the computer, and there's no more middle, the bourgeois middle's gone, so we've got a very high end and a very low end. And so it was kind of definitely caught a lot of people's ears because it was, you had basically maybe one of the last of the Rockefeller Republicans, right, who's making this he's making a forecast that would suggest. And then you take that in conjunction with, there's an academic on faculty at UVA right now who is saying that over the course of the same history, if you look at a heterogeneous pluralistic democracy, when it gets more and more challenged, it goes through more and more of these consternations that you point out, where more deployment of federal. There's a station manager here in the city at Wilmata who talked about there was a melee 1 point years ago in the L'Enfant Plaza metro station, and then he locked himself in the booth for security purposes. But when he looked out of his booth, there were so many jurisdictions that had descended upon the station and inside the station. When he counted the number of jurisdictions, we used to talk about this in North Miami Beach, where I lived, that the budget for the police alone in the city of North Miami Beach went from 40% of the budget to 70% of the budget. Then when we had the 2008 recession, the tax revenue collapsed, and they're like, why is the but we already have a Dade County police force. We got Metro. We got a da-da-da-da. Why do we even have a city police force in conjunction with or in addition to a Dade County? So eventually the city council had to just like, okay, listen, police chief, you need to like fire this many people. He's like, I'm not gonna fire anybody. Okay, then you're fired. And then, you know, they had to basically use the axe themselves because you have this policing thing. And so it's interesting that when you discuss community-oriented policing as well, that was regarded at one time as the ultimate or the best, the most optimal solution. So if in fact COP or community-oriented policing has had failures associated with it too, that's leading to maybe even more of this nihilistic attitude or more revolutionary mindset that got to start over from scratch and got to deinstitutionalize. But that creates also more of a, I don't know, maybe more of an anarchical mindset, so more of a revolutionary mindset in different pockets.
Okay, so then several things. Let's see. So community-oriented policing has in many respects failed, but the failure is more in the fact that it hasn't prevented uprisings than in the fact that the police continue to behave viciously, especially as a color. Because the purpose of community-oriented policing was never really to change that core function of policing, but maintaining the existing inequalities. It was to provide the police an avenue to legitimizing their actions and to gaining public support and also therefore access to increased resources that only the community can provide, things like information, right? So it clearly hasn't succeeded in that main mission of getting people on the cop side and preventing arrest, as we saw in 2020. The fact that police brutality has continued is more like an operational mistake than a failure of the program, because the program was never really intended to stop that. In terms of Romney's comments, I didn't hear them. From how you characterize them, doesn't sound particularly surprising, because he's seen those dynamics unfolding in his own party over the last 5-6 years, and has been one of the people most vocal and be worried about it. You're right that the sort of the criticism of community policing does tend in a more revolutionary direction and a more abolitionist direction. And it also makes sense that leads people who politically align with the police in a more to respond in a like extra institutional kind of manner, right? And so the polarization is a two-way street. Like both sides are polarized. I happen to think that one of the poles is correct. But as you were talking about that, I was thinking that the obvious thing that I miss in terms of things that were taboo and now are less taboo is the use of political violence. And that I mentioned that the militancy of demonstrations in 2020 was much more popular than I think anyone would have anticipated. On the other side, there's also the attempt to legitimize the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. We've also seen increasing exchanges of gunfire in demonstrations, which was like it's not like that never happened in the recent past, but it was pretty unusual.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Portland going on for what, 3 months?
Yeah.
So I mean, like there must, I mean, how many exchanges there were? I mean, that, like you said, that's like a new precedent for duration.
Yeah.
I mean, Portland has always had a reputation and so forth, but for 3 months.
Yeah, 101 days.
101 days, and how many exchanges? You know, I mean, they probably.
I mean, there was one that was famous because a person who identified as an anti-fascist shot and killed a person who was associated with an organization called Patriot Prayer, and then was hunted down and killed by the Marshal Service like a week or so later. But over the last like several years, it's been increasingly common that even demonstrations that aren't like burning and looting affairs, like attract right-wing counter demonstrators who are often armed and sometimes like fire shots. It's been pretty unusual that they hit anyone, but they have. And I think last October, there was a demonstration which by all accounts was relatively tame, in which someone opened fire, hit, I think, 5 people, killed 1 or 2 of them. One of them was paralyzed, was stopped because another person in the demonstration was also armed and shot him. He survived and is now waiting trial. And so that's sort of like the sort of Weimarization of politics is a recent development. I mean, it's not unprecedented in American history, but it's not how things went from, you know, sometime in the 70s until just the last couple of years. And I think yeah, so that is something which was practically unthinkable and is now showing up in the margins, and which I worry is going to become increasingly common in the next few years.
Oh, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question if you want, or we can.
How gloomy do you want to get?
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I could get going here, so I can get, you know, if you want me to.
let's give it another dose of gloom.
There we go. All right, so this is the yeah, I appreciate this. This is actually my first time here.
Welcome.
So, you know, we need this because we have busboys and poets, we have politics and prose, but you know, this is the 20-year anniversary of the publication of Rise of the Creative Class. So that's Professor Richard Florida, who at that time also had advocated he had recommended to a number of Black mayors, and at the time, which were majority Black cities, including the mayor here in DC 20 years ago, that hey, the only way to revitalize urban decay is you got to bring in software engineers, because that's going to just bring in more. It's going to bring in venture capital, private equity. It's going to revitalize what has undergone post-industrial collapse. Then in 2017, about 5 years ago, he actually mollifies the thesis a little bit, because what happens with that type of gentrification is you had over the past 20 years in this city alone, the white population has gone up over the past 20 years by 200%. Black population dropped by 25%. So now what's becoming a little more mainstream in many circles is the only way to mitigate that is going to be increases in subsidized rental housing. Otherwise, you're driving more and more of the non-white population out into the suburbs, and that's where you're actually seeing suburban poverty go up by large amounts while urban poverty continues to decline. Software engineers by nature tend to be mostly white males, but also a lot of Indians and so forth. But some cases they're here just on an H-1B visa, and if they can get that extended, then they're able to stay longer and so forth. If you take that in the context of an academic faculty at UVA talking about heterogeneous pluralistic democracies undergoing their greatest test in history. Do you see anything associated with Professor Richard Florida's modification or adjustment to his original thesis, which he published 2017, 5 years ago, where he says the coming urban crisis? That's his title vis-a-vis and versus his title from 20 years ago, which was Rise of the Creative Class. So, you know, you're here in an urban environment that has the highest concentration of PhDs on the East Coast outside of Boston. And that was always an irritant to people like Nixon, came here from California and so forth. And the previous administration was always trying to talk about how you got to bring in more people from the Midwest and because you have you might have an element where everyone's resume has to say or has to have presence of Boston, New York, DC on the resume in order to make them mainstream. What do you think about urban gentrification over the past 20 years in the context also of everything else that's going on, and whether or not this academic on the faculty of UVA is accurate to suggest that, in line with the Romney thesis, that heterogeneous pluralistic democracies are undergoing their greatest test?
Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone that gentrification had the effect of displacing poor people, and especially people of color, especially Black people, because that was kind of the point. And this was theorized in advance in a couple of pretty important ways. One was a housing and urban development document from the early 1980s called Spatial Deconcentration, which made the argument that the unrest in the 60s resulted as a result of groups of people who were badly impacted by the social structure. So people who were oppressed being concentrated in relatively dense areas, and that made it possible for them to engage in certain kinds of resistance, which would not be possible if they were more dispersed. And so housing and urban development at that point made the argument that the thing that was needed was to reverse white flight, bring white people back into the cities and displace people of color so that they would, especially into suburbs, so that they would be more thinly distributed, which would make it less possible to either burn down or barricade big parts of the city. Similarly, more influentially, ultimately, in the 1982, I believe, article "Broken Windows" by James Q. Wilson and George Kelly, which argued for the model of policing which became really prominent in the 1990s, where police focus on very small quality of life issues, and so enforce laws against, turnstile jumping and littering and really like misdemeanor and lower kind of enforcement. They were very open about the idea that the thing that was going to bring down crime rates was to make cities less hospitable for poor people and more hospitable for entrepreneurs. And so there's a inherent and admitted kind of class war element to that project. And there was always, often gentrification is conceived of as just sort of the market doing what the market does, right? But that overlooks the policy decisions that went into shaping it. Things like business improvement districts, and which is essentially a subsidy to open businesses in areas that are being gentrified. It also omits the sort of lost opportunities, the policy options that were considered, of things like providing better housing, subsidized housing, public housing, however you want to sort of cash that out, which would be a more obvious way. Like if you take seriously the Broken Windows thesis, that it's signs of neglect that produce criminality, like providing resources for people to have better homes would be the more straightforward way of addressing that problem, rather than getting the police to issue tickets for your muffler being too loud or whatever, right? Or citing people for a big container, or citing people for jaywalking, all this stuff that made Giuliani famous in New York in the 90s. So I think it's an interesting observation, and I'm not familiar with either of the pieces, that a person who was pushing a sort of like entrepreneurial revitalization strategy a few years ago would realize that that's going to have that is having these other results, which then are of course going to contribute to sort of the interracial and interclass tensions in the areas where that's happening, and then come around to wanting to ameliorate that in some ways. It's probably something you should have thought about at the outset.
Yeah, because he's coming out and like, the original thesis, 20-year anniversary of it, Rise of the Created Class, then half a decade ago, 2017, comes out and says, I didn't realize the inequities would be so exacerbated that quickly, and therefore now I advocate for subsidized rental housing. So I guess the other final thing that comes to mind with a number of us who live in Arlington have been, when it comes to social housing, we've been aggregated and congregated in developments that were constructed in the 1940s for all the workers at the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
So what some of us have been trying to argue to the county is that there is a lack of mixed income development. So we've all been concentrated in these. Colonial Village, for example, was built during the Great Depression. Eleanor Roosevelt was part of the New Deal. Eleanor Roosevelt planted a number of trees there. But a lot of the other developments were built in the 40s. Now they've been renovated, so they've got a nice quality of life compared to, say, not having an air conditioner or central air, or not having certain things that were not available back during the 40s. But it is raising the question as to whether spreading us out a bit more would be. We're finding, for example, a lot of luxury market rate developments going up in the Ballston-Roslyn corridor, and of what's called the CAF, or the Committed Affordable Unit ratio, that's like a fraction of a percent, or it's in a low single-digit percentage, and so it does tend to exacerbate and not do much in the way of trying to improve mixed income development, assuming that mixed income development would be constructive for trying to spread us out into a more wider area within the county, which is an urban county by and large, semi-urban county, as opposed to having us all concentrated in small pockets. But that's also going to necessitate places like the Urban Institute here in DC, or other so-called think tanks being contracted by the county to do a top-down macro analysis as far as whether there is a lack of mixed income development, and whether or not improving mixed income development would be beneficial, as opposed to having all of us concentrated in the same older complexes that we're building.
I don't know enough about the local groups, but it's interesting.
Yeah, because it's, here in this city, if you look at it, Zoom is killing all the office buildings, and Amazon killed all of the L-shaped suburban strip malls from the 60s. Fairfax County is now openly asking question whether they need to put up more social housing in these L-shaped suburban strip malls that have all been killed by e-commerce and Amazon. And here in this city, if they're going to start converting empty office buildings that were killed by Zoom into more luxury condos, that's going to cause more antipathy, because there's going to be questions about a lack of subsidized rental housing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible talk. If you don't have your copy yet, you can go ahead and grab it. And Kristian, if you wouldn't mind signing mine